on streets, shutters torn from walls.
The organisation running Scotland's food banks is calling for a UK-wide inquiry.
This is a big problem in Scotland, and the latest figures show it's getting worse.
We currently have rising fuel costs battering households, resulting in a high risk of many people.
This mock weather forecast is predicting a poverty superstorm. It's part of a campaign by a coalition of charities warning that the welfare reforms and the soaring bills are forcing many Scots into poverty.
And depression for those most vulnerable.
I wrote an article back in 2011 which only touched upon the topic of poverty within Scotland. Since then I've noticed just how much further Scotland is falling into poverty, with our suffering families turning to food banks. More than 13 million people live in poverty in the UK, and up to 3.5 million of these are children. The rising cost of food and fuel, combined with a static income, high unemployment and changes to benefit, are causing more and more people to come to food banks for help. As a result, food banks are sprouting up across the country. In Scotland alone, there are already 45 Thistle Trust food banks. 500,000 people are now dependent on food aid, relying on a rapidly expanding network of food banks and support programmes. Food banks provide a minimum of 3 days emergency food and support to people experiencing crisis in the UK.
So it's everything, from breakfast to supper, and some snacks to feed people.
I think it's the media, it's raising the profile of it, and I think it's always been there, and people just couldn't manage. They've done without. We've had many stories where even yet mums do without food to make sure that children are fed. But now, because they know that it's there and frontline workers are guiding into it, then they have the use of it. I think there's families out there who are genuine. I do think that there is people who would use anyway, but we don't see a lot of them. We get people coming in and they are entitled to 3 boxes on the one assessment, and then we don't see them again. That's enough to keep them going.
We'll continue to work with local authorities, third sector partners and others how best to ensure that those who use food banks have access to appropriate advice and support, and I've asked the Poverty Alliance to carry out more research into food poverty in Scotland.
So at the Poverty Alliance, we believe Scotland is a rich country and that there is no need for poverty to exist. I think the existence of poverty is a political choice, and it has been the political agenda that has allowed poverty to develop to such a massive scale in Scotland and the UK. Part of the reason for this, I think, is that as a society we tend to blame the individual for their poverty. So we say that they're poor because they don't work, or they're poor because they're addicted to drugs. And actually even the UK government's own child poverty strategy consultation recently cited the reasons of poverty as worklessness, family breakdown, drug and alcohol addiction, and we have completely ignored the structural sides of poverty and the fact that actually there aren't jobs out there, and coupled with that, the jobs there are often low paid, 0 hours, and as a result of that we've seen a massive increase as well in the numbers of people in work poverty. So in terms of like how we're going to tackle that, really we need to actually look at the causes of poverty, and that requires us as a society and for politicians to change the way we think about poverty. It isn't an individual thing. It is a societal problem, and as a result, to tackle that we need real political will, really. It's going to require a massive overhaul of tax and welfare systems. Benefit levels are far too low for people to live an adequate standard of living, and also we need to see real increases in terms of wages. The fact that people can work a 40-hour week and still not earn enough to live on is just unacceptable in 21st century Scotland. There has been a lot of good work done, particularly in Scotland, in terms of tackling child poverty. But we've seen this year the new child poverty statistics have actually started to reverse that, and we've seen an increase now. Part of that is as a result of the UK government's welfare reform regime, and we know that while they've restated their commitment to eradicating child poverty by 2020, it's virtually impossible for that to happen now. IFS are predicting that we're going to see at least 100,000 more children in child poverty by 2020. So really it requires the government to wake up and realise that you can't on one hand be affirming your commitment to eradicating child poverty and on the other pushing more and more children into child poverty through your welfare reform.
That box there says 217.
Do you think that the recent government cuts, frozen wages and changes to benefits have anything to do with the increase in food banks across the country?
Well, I suppose to a question like that, the answer would be yes, yes and yes. Clearly the economic situation has not been of the rosiest in the past few years. Equally, it's regrettable that the UK government, through its welfare reform packages, has seen fit to apply austerity to those that can least afford it. That's why we have establishments like this across the country today.
Do you think that if Scotland does go independent, that there will be more families turning towards it or less?
I think Scotland's has been stated by some of the major economic establishments like Standard & Poor's as the 14th wealthiest country in the world. But currently today, we, as part of the UK, we have an income gap which is obscene. I mean, it's obscene that the 5 richest families in London and the South East earn more income than the 5 million people on lowest incomes. What we have to do in the new Scotland is ensure that that income gap is reduced, that the wealth is more fairly distributed, and hopefully that will see the demise of food banks. And why haven't we done anything about it? Because we haven't had the powers to do something about it. We have to change the culture. We have to reflect what I believe is the true nature of Scots, particularly in being compassionate, being neighbourly. We might whine and groan about things, but at the end of the day, we're very aware of what is happening to our neighbours and our colleagues. And I think that independence and the powers to do something about something that needs to be done about will achieve that with the new form of government in Scotland.
Another point that I wanted to highlight was the growth of pantomime poverty in television today. We all watch them, The Scheme, The Jeremy Kyle Show, even Benefit Street, but no one is actually recognising the growing fetishisation of poverty. Pantomime poverty is more and more the norm, but what about the reasons behind the majority? Government cuts, economic collapse, rising costs of living, these all contribute to families struggling every day to make ends meet.
Programmes such as Benefit Street we think are very, very unhelpful.
Yeah.
They increase the stigma around living in poverty, and they focus on those people with chaotic lives. Best example I could think of this recently was, I don't know if you saw, there was a BBC documentary called A Commonwealth City.
Yeah, all bits of it.
Yeah, and it was looking at the impact of the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow's East End. There was lots of good stuff in it. It did focus on the community spirit in the East End, the community building. But most of the visual imagery of the East End was cramped and cluttered. You saw people out in the streets drinking, and there was people with really chaotic lives. Whereas by comparison, whenever they showed the West End, it was just a much calmer, nicer environment. And we found just that actually those who were depicted as living in poverty were a separate group of people removed from mainstream society. They weren't people like us, they were people in poverty. And they were seen as just an underproductive group. And we know that this isn't the true face of poverty in Scotland. We know that actually most children living in poverty now live in a household where people work. It doesn't show those people, and it doesn't show that there are people who, for whatever reason out there, can't work, but they still have a valuable contribution to make to society. And it's a wider problem than just these programmes, since that governments tend to think, and a lot of people think, work is the only way out of poverty. And while we'll agree that work is definitely and can be a very good way out of poverty, unless that work pays, then it's not a way out of poverty. And it's also not the only way that people can contribute to society. There are plenty of people out there who can't work and will never be able to work, but that doesn't mean that they're scroungers and they don't have anything else to give. At programmes like this, it's either you're a hard-working family or you're some skiver kicking around the East End drinking during the day.
You know, regrettably, voyeurism is a feature of nature. I do think that, you know, the focus by some of these programmes on the regrettable poverty of others is unnecessary, and it may seem a form of escapism for those that appear on the programmes, but what we have to be alert to and aware of and sensitive to is the actual implications it has for those who live with this poverty day to day. It is not a form of entertainment. Volunteers, by the way, who should be commended for the work they do. They're quite outstanding.
Regardless of how Scotland votes on September 19th, we're still going to face the same issues. There will still be poverty, there will still be people who just can't afford to get by, and we hope that regardless of the result, that all political parties will come together in Scotland to find that real political will to actually make a change.
So that's quite strenuous.